Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Locked Door. This episode is a hard one that truthfully I never wanted to record. As many of you know, my dear friend and pen pal Richard Tabler was executed on February 13th, 2025, and today I want to talk about that, about who he was, what happened, and what comes next. I've been sitting with a lot of emotions, grief, anger, heartbreak, but also love. Because despite what the state tried to say about Richard, he was someone who mattered. Someone who made a difference in my life and in the lives of so many others. And I want to honor him here in this space with all of you. We're also going to take this time to revisit the death penalty itself, why it's still a broken, unjust system. And toward the end of the episode, I want to bust one of the most common myths I hear about the death penalty, because there are still so many misconceptions that keep this system alive. Before we dive in, I do want to give a content warning. Today's episode will talk about execution, loss, and death row, so please take care of yourself as you listen. Pause if you need to, come back later, or skip this episode entirely if that's what's best for you. Your mental and emotional well-being comes first. It's really hard to know where to begin when I talk about Richard. I've started and stopped this part of the episode so many times because there's just no easy way to put it into words. What it feels like to lose someone you love in this way. I've known Richard for over 4 years. We wrote letters, we sent messages, we talked on the phone. He was there for me through some of the hardest moments of my life. When I felt alone or overwhelmed, Richard always found a way to make me laugh or remind me that I mattered. He used to call himself my therapist, and honestly, sometimes he really was. Richard was funny, thoughtful, smart. He was deeply religious. He found his faith on death row, and he clung to it in a way that gave him so much strength. He had this way of always saying, "This too shall pass." Like no matter how bad things got, he believed that somehow, someday, everything would be okay. And he was talented. He was an artist, a writer. He created these beautiful pieces of art that reflected his inner world, his regrets, his hopes, his faith, and his pain. I remember when he sent me a drawing he made for my birthday, and I was just blown away by the care he put into it. He wanted to make people feel loved, even when he didn't always feel loved himself. You know, a lot of people think that everyone on death row is a monster, but Richard was not a monster. He was a man, a human being, who had made mistakes, yes, but who had also grown and changed in incredible ways. He cared for others, even up until the end. He was there for fellow incarcerated, especially when they were close to their execution dates. He prayed with them, talked with them, helped them find peace. And now he's gone. The state took him from us. And I won't lie, there is an emptiness in my life now that I don't really know how to fill. There are moments I still pick up my phone expecting a message or think of something I want to tell him. And then I remember. His death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the end of a friendship, the love of someone who truly saw me. And that's what hurts the most, I think. Knowing that his voice, his laugh, his prayers for me, those are things I'll never get to hear again. And in the aftermath, I felt a mix of emotions. Grief, obviously, anger, but also this deep sense of responsibility to make sure Richard's story doesn't just disappear. To remind people that he was more than a number, more than a case file, and more than the worst thing he ever did. So that's the part of why I'm here today, to tell you about Richard, to say his name out loud, to make sure that even though he's gone, his life, his real life, gets to be seen and remembered. If there's one thing I could ask of anyone listening, it's this. Remember that people on death row are people. They are complicated, imperfect, but human. Richard was someone who loved, who laughed, created beauty in a place where there was so little of it. And he deserved more than what the system gave him. I'm going to take a breath here, and when I come back, I want to talk more about the death penalty itself, because Richard's story isn't just about him, it's about all the others who are still waiting on death row, and why we need to rethink what justice really means. Now I want to take a few minutes to talk about why I'm so strongly against the death penalty. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I believe that our justice system should be about rehabilitation, not just punishment. But when it comes to the death penalty, it feels like we're just giving up on people entirely, deciding that some people are beyond redemption. And that's something I can't accept. And honestly, what keeps me up at night is thinking, what if the system got it wrong? What if an innocent person is executed? That's not something we can undo. There's no coming back from that. And let's be real, the system gets it wrong a lot more than people want to admit. There have been more than 190 people in the US who were sentenced to death and later exonerated. 190 people who were literally waiting to die for something they did not do. And that's just the ones who were lucky enough to have someone fighting for them. Imagine how many more might be innocent but never get that chance. One of the things that really bothers me is how unfair the death penalty is, especially when it comes to race. Did you know that people of color are way more likely to end up on death row than white people, even when the crimes are similar? Let me give you an example that still blows my mind. In Florida, black defendants who kill white victims are 3.5 times more likely to get the death penalty than white defendants who kill black victims. Just think about that for a second. We're talking about life and death decisions. Who gets to live, who has to die, and race is playing a role. That should scare all of us. And it's not just race. Poverty plays a huge role too. Most people on death row couldn't afford good lawyers. They were assigned overworked, underpaid public defenders who didn't have the resources to properly fight for them. And when you're facing the death penalty, that can mean the difference between life and death. I remember someone who had been sitting on death row for over a decade. In one of his letters, he told me about the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. How at times he felt completely forgotten, like the world had moved on without him. Reading those words, I felt the weight of what this system does to people, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. And that's not just his story, it's the story of so many others. People who never had a real shot at justice because of the color of their skin, where they were born, or how much money they had. The more I connected with people behind bars, the more I realized how deeply flawed our justice system really is, especially for those who are marginalized or can't afford proper representation. And that's why I keep speaking up about this. That's why I share Richard's story and the stories of others like him, because I believe that if more people knew the truth about the death penalty, if they knew how unfair and broken the system is, they'd think twice about supporting it. The death penalty isn't about justice. It's about power. It's about who has a voice and who doesn't. And it's about a system that decides some people's lives are worth less than others. So if you've been on the fence about the death penalty, if you've never really thought about it before, I hope that gives you something to think about. Because behind every execution, there's a real person. And behind every real person, there's a story that deserves to be heard. Let's move on to a Mythbuster segment. Before we wrap up today, I want to take a moment to bust one of the biggest myths I hear about the death penalty. And that is the idea that only the worst of the worst end up on death row. I wish that were true. I wish we could say that the system only targets people who are beyond help, but honestly, that couldn't be further from reality. First, a lot of people on death row have severe mental illnesses or intellectual disabilities, things that should have been taken into account during their trials but often weren't. Instead, these are people who were thrown into a system that saw them as disposable. And then there are people like Richard. Yes, he made mistakes, serious mistakes. But to say he was the worst of the worst? No, not even close. He was someone who grew, who changed, who tried to be a better man every single day behind those walls. Someone who helped others on death row find peace. Someone who loved and cared about his friends on the outside. If you think the death penalty is only for the worst people, let me remind you of those 190 people exonerated from death row. If they were truly the worst of the worst, why were they later found innocent? Why were they set free? And what about the people who never get exonerated, but had broken childhoods, untreated trauma, or grew up in environments that never gave them a real chance? Are they not human? Are they not worthy of compassion and a second chance? The truth is, the death penalty doesn't target the worst. It targets the most vulnerable. The poor, people of color, people with mental health struggles, people who couldn't afford good lawyers. So next time you hear someone say, well, they deserve to die for what they did, I want you to pause and ask, who decided that? Who gets to decide who is beyond saving? Because if we're honest, the people making those decisions, the judges, the juries, prosecutors, they're human too. And humans get it wrong. And that's why I never stop speaking out against this system, because people like Richard deserve that chance to live. So as we close out today's episode, I just want to say this. Richard mattered, his laugh mattered, his story mattered, and I hope that by sharing a piece of him with you, I've been able to show that no one is beyond redemption. No one is just the sum of their worst mistakes. I'm still grieving, I'm still angry, but I'm also determined. Determined to keep fighting against a system that continues to take life when there are better ways to seek justice. If Richard's story has touched you, if it has made you think about the death penalty in a different way, I want to encourage you to share this episode with someone. Start a conversation. Talk about what justice really means, because the more we talk about it, the harder it is to ignore. And if you want to do more, there are organizations that fight for people on death row, for criminal justice reform, and for abolition of the death penalty. I link some in the show notes, like Wire of Hope, Death Penalty Action, and the Innocence Project. Please check them out. I also want to take a moment to thank everyone who reached out, prayed for Richard, and showed support in his final days. You have no idea what it meant, not just to me, but to him. Knowing he wasn't alone, knowing people cared, gave him so much peace in the end. I'll be back next time with more stories, more conversations, and hopefully more hope. Until then, take care of yourselves, hold your loved one close, and remember, no one is beyond saving. Thanks for listening.